There can be no lasting peace in Syria without justice. And it's the job of my colleague, Catherine Marchi-Uhel, to try to deliver that. She is the head of IIM, the UN body investigating war crimes committed in Syria since the conflict broke out in 2011.
You see people who are not just looking for revenge, but looking for justice. It's in a way having faith in the future, having faith that even if the most horrific things have happened, there will be a way to account for it. There will be a way to repair what can be repaired, and often you cannot repair, but you can give some signs of recognition, some signs of justice, which help people moving forward in their life.
From the United Nations, I'm Melissa Fleming. Welcome to Awake at Night. Catherine, why is it so important to investigate war crimes in Syria?
I think it's really critical to investigate war crimes, crime against humanity, and even genocide committed in Syria, because one cannot think of peace in Syria one day without accountability for the most serious international crimes. And that's why we're doing this work, for the victims primarily, and having in the back of our mind a better Syria for the future.
I mean, some people might say, why spend time looking into the war crimes of the past when so many people in Syria are suffering now?
I think victims, survivors need accountability. They have this call for justice. They have many other needs as well, humanitarian in nature as well. But it's very difficult to move forward and build a durable peace without accountability, with impunity for the most serious crimes. The purpose is not to prosecute every crime. We know it's impossible and it's probably not even desirable, but making sure that the most serious ones are accounted for, and also looking at other forms than criminal justice. Justice is not limited to criminal justice. Finding about the whereabouts of missing persons, what happened to them, the fate is also an important and crucial demand of the Syrian victims and survivors.
It sounds like you're really feeling this responsibility to the victims, and that wars not only create enormous suffering from the humanitarian sense of the word, but it is impossible to just deliver food aid and shelter aid and think that people will move on absent accountability.
Yeah, this is crucial, of course, for the immediate needs, but the need for justice is there too. And when you speak with victims and survivors, they are conscious that the path to justice will take time. They know that it's not an immediate response that is possible, but they also want this work to be done, and they want to make sure that those who have documented crimes, and many Syrians have done that, courageous Syrian civil society actors have spent time, sometimes at the price of their life, to make sure that those crimes are documented, and they want to make sure that something is done with that. And that's part of our work.
Because I was going to ask you, how do you gather evidence? I mean, I'm sure that, I guess there's not much cooperation from the government. Or how do you go about, and how hard is it to find?
So we have to date received no cooperation from the Syrian government, but first of all, crimes are committed on many sides of the Syrian situation, as you know. Documenting means establishing relationship of trust with various entities that have been documenting these crimes. And our mandate, given to us by the General Assembly, is to collect, preserve, analyze, and build case files that can be used in courts of justice. We are independent and impartial by our mandate, and we need to investigate all sides of the conflict, not just government, but also groups like Daesh that have been committing very serious crimes, how do you collect? Well, as I said, you need to establish a relationship of trust, and you also need to engage with those who are recipient of the work we do, which are the jurisdictions. Currently, a number of these jurisdictions are war crimes units in various countries in the world, and they are exercising jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute crimes committed in Syria.
Is there an example of that? I believe there was a jurisdiction recently in Germany.
Yes, Germany has been extremely active on Syrian crimes committed by a variety of perpetrators from various sides, and there has been a very important case which led to 2 judgments which have found that there was crimes against humanity committed in Syria involving the regime of Syria in various detention facilities. So these judgments concern crimes attributed to people who were officials of the Syrian Arab Republic at the time of the crimes. There have been a number of judgments also finding genocide was committed by members of Daesh. And there have been a variety of judgments issued in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, concerning many other actors.
I mean, you mentioned the Syrians that have collected the evidence. They must have taken terrible risks. Are there any? Do they remain in Syria? Is there anyone you can't forget?
Many people have left, but there are also still Syrians who have documenting crimes that are still in Syria or that still have their family in Syria. So certainly protection concerns are high, and these have not disappeared. There have been documentation done at a time when the conflict was taking a different direction than what it does now. So some Syrians were in areas of Syria which was under the control of other parties. These has changed, and of course it actually makes the situation of people still in Syria very complex. And so when we engage with sources, whether they are still in Syria or not, we have a responsibility to make sure that we are not endangering them. And it's an element of the accountability process, which is very important.
I guess part of your day job is, collecting evidence of war crimes, is collecting evidence of horrific torture and murder and rape against people. I mean, how do you cope with that emotionally?
Well, it's not the best side of humanity, certainly, but in all of this situation, you also see some glimpse of hope, I would say. You see people who are not just, even among the victims, who are not just looking for revenge, but looking for justice. It's in a way having faith in the future, having faith that even if the most horrific things have happened, I mean, there will be a way to account for it. There will be a way to repair what can be repaired, and often you cannot repair the irreparable, but you can give some signs of recognition, some signs of justice, which help people moving forward in their life. So I think the way you protect yourself when you're dealing on a daily basis with this kind of horrific situation and materials is by trying to have in your life areas which are more peaceful and more joyful, and also maybe realizing that you cannot do this work without being affected. So being aware, self-aware that you have to protect yourself, that you may not feel well sometimes and you'll have to deal with it and to get help.
How do you deal with it?
Well, in an early part of my career, when I was in charge of juveniles and crimes against juveniles, there have been times where I felt it was useful to consult a psychologist, for instance, and to talk about what was, very difficult to deal with in the daily work. And this helps. So we need to be aware of it. If you want to help the victims, you need to be in good shape yourself. If you are affected by traumatic events, even if it's a secondary trauma, you may not be in the best shape to help. So, having a healthy life apart from the job and trying to take distance when you need. That's no fantastic recipe, but it helps.
Where are you based?
We are based in Geneva,
In Geneva.
but of course the team is traveling around the world,
Absolutely.
including in the region. Obviously, we have no access to Syria.
But you have access to
Countries
the
around.
countries around, and many of the victims are
Yes,
refugees in these countries.
in these countries and also in other parts of the world, of course. Now, the Syrian refugees are everywhere.
They're everywhere. I know, which is also one of the big
Of
tragedies of this war. Is there something? I mean, during this war, before we move on to other parts of your life, I mean, is there anything that has particularly one particular crime that you've been looking into, or a victim that has really stayed with you? And
Well, there are many, but I would say probably crimes against children are those which are often the less visible. We know they exist. We mention them. When you read an article, newspaper article, they're mentioned, but they're often invisible. And a number of female victims as well are often less visible. They tend to be less interviewed for many reasons, but they also tend to suffer from other impact of the crime than the crimes themselves. And this is with me because I think if you want to build the future, you need to take those aspects into account. You need to give visibility to those traumas, and you also need to engage with those victims. But more than one victim in particular, I think I found the possibility of engaging directly with victim communities, to speak about the work we do, to listen to them, understand their priorities, to sit with them, to let them know of the efforts we're taking. And when you have a situation like Syria, where, I mean, there are tangible justice opportunities, but there are also many unknowns as to what will happen. So you need to use that time also to share where you are, to explain the difficulties, but also show the progresses. And you need to consult, I think, victims and survivors about some of the possibilities before you. We cannot seize every single opportunity with the same, putting the same efforts in every of them. So it's important to have that dialogue. It's empowering, I think, for victims and survivors to let them have a say in what the work that we are doing. Of course, we have to remain impartial and independent, but it doesn't mean that there is no room for engagement.
I just wanted to circle back to, you mentioned that children victims are something that really disturb you. Can you just describe what the war crimes that have been alleged and committed, how that has had an effect on children directly or indirectly?
Well, a number of children are being maimed or killed or suffer. Some of them have been tortured as well, or they have been affected by attacks.
Schools even
have been attacked. Their means of living of their families, they lost parents, they lost means of living, they lost opportunities to have a normal life. So I think they are really the primary victims. Even, they are affected directly in a number of instances. And in the context of Syria, as you know, we have a number of allegations of unlawful attacks, including using means which are prohibited, such as chemical weapons. Children are among those victims, right? So there are the crimes that are directed to children. I'm thinking in particular of enrolling children into combatants, sending them to training camps and then using them in hostilities. These are types of crimes which are targeting children particularly, but all the other crimes of which children are victims are also extremely serious crimes. And often we tend to, we know it exists, but if you're not looking specifically for evidence of crimes affecting children, the cases that you build won't reflect that, right? And it's not necessarily easy to do it because you need to make a dedicated effort. I will compare this, although there are many aspects that are different, with looking at gender-based crimes, right? If you don't look for it, you won't find it. So you really need as a
Why is that?
because there is a tendency of looking first at of interviewing first male witnesses. That's a clear tendency. There are also, it's also a field, international criminal law, where you have many male investigators, and often they are not, or at least in the past, they were not necessarily so comfortable investigating sexual violence and other types of crime. And I think more than the gender of the participant in the accountability effort, it's more the approach that you take. If you decide that you want to have that understanding of violence that is not driven just by, I don't know, religion, political motivation, but that is driven by the gender or by the age of victims, if you are willing to look into the impact of gender-based crimes and crime against children, you're going to have to make a dedicated effort to do that. You're going to have to make sure that you recruit people who are trained to do that. You're going to have to make sure that when you develop an investigative plan, this is part of the plan, right? And it has to become almost part of your DNA as an investigator, as a lawyer, that you're going to include that in your assessment. And that's part of the approach we've taken at the IIIM. We have developed a gender strategy specifically for that. And we've developed and are still developing our approach on children. We engage with children and youth, Syrian children and youth, to start understanding their perspective. So these approaches are taking time, sometimes easier to do without that, but I think it's very important. That's why we decided to do that.
With sexual violence and conflict, there's a lot of shame on the part of the women wanting to speak out.
And men as well. I mean,
there have been reports of
course,
sexual violence against men as a weapon of war.
This is very true, but it's also very important to understand that there are also many crimes which are not sexual in nature, but are motivated by the gender of the victim. Different treatment depending on the gender of the victim. One work we did recently, which is being shared with jurisdiction, was to look at the differentiated treatment of women, men, boys and girls by members of the group Daesh. And there are very different approaches motivated by the ideology of the group, which has really targeted those different individuals with very different treatments.
And you mentioned Daesh a few times. Mm-hmm. That's Islamic State. Mm-hmm. They became a big factor in recent years in northern Syria. Mm-hmm. The kinds of crimes that you're looking at, can you describe them?
The cases in Germany that we were talking about have been focusing, a lot of them, on the commission of genocide by the group against the Yazidi community.
Beyond northern Iraq, it's also...
Yes, so there are parts of the crimes committed in Iraq, but then also women and children being brought into Syria, since the group was operating on both sides of the border, and girls and their mothers being often turned into slavery, sexual slavery, but also domestic slavery. There have been a number of cases of looking at the particular treatment of those girls, and cases which led to convictions in Germany, in Sweden. We also see investigation, and we've been contributing to that, which look at the discriminatory treatment of female, but also male boys who are subjected to specific treatment, sent to training camps, and forced into training and then fighting, and the girls, of course, subjected to the other treatments of slavery, and some of the girls have died. So genocide on one hand, when it comes to because of the willingness to destroy in part, in whole and in part, the Yazidi group, but also crime against humanity.
Is it frustrating to you that because of international disagreements on Syria, there's not yet a tribunal to prosecute any cases that your organization, your mechanism prepares? Is that frustrating?
It is frustrating that we have an international criminal court, which, without the use of veto at the Security Council, would have been seized of the Syrian situation. You could also have imagined for a case as broad and as protracted than the Syrian situation that maybe even a dedicated tribunal, as we had for the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda, could have been a solution. But this would have required, again, agreement at the political level, at the Security Council level, or a situation in Syria where the government is accepting that. So, yes, it's frustrating. At the same time, even when all the conditions are met, you know that this is a type of work that is taking time. So it's frustrating, but it doesn't... I'm not looking at the situation as, set in time and in stone. It's an evolving situation. It's important that the information, the evidence is preserved. I'm personally hopeful that there will be, at some stage, complement to the current efforts for a more comprehensive accountability for Syria. So frustration, yes, but not to the point of disabling us to move forward. On the contrary, I would say.
Do you think that justice always does come someday?
I mean, not always, but in many situations it does. And I think in the case of Syria, I think they're in movement. You're not going to stop it like this.
What is keeping you awake at night?
The risk of not being sufficiently strong in our advocacy for justice, the fact of missing some opportunities, the fact of not being understood by victims and survivors as working for them. But I usually sleep well at night because I put my energy in this work, a lot of it, and sleep is a way, as we spoke earlier, to help you cope with what you are dealing with.
You just collapse.
You collapse, indeed.
You have spent much of your career pursuing justice for war crimes. You have tried people for crimes relating to conflicts in Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia. What drives you personally to do this?
I think in part it's part of something that happened to a friend of my family. I was still very, very young at the time. I think I was probably around 10 when I heard of what happened to a friend of my family who had been in concentration camps and victim of medical experiences, and that stuck with me for a while. I at the time I didn't know I would ever work in the law field, but I was really struck by that. I think the first time I heard of
you met this friend.
Yes, I met this friend. He wasn't speaking about it himself, but I knew from his niece what had happened to him.
So he was in a Nazi concentration camp.
Yes, he was in Dachau, and
what happened?
He was victim of medical experiment, and I mean he survived.
The Mengele kind of.
Oh yeah, I never asked very much detail, but I know basically that's what happened to me, and that was the first time I was exposed to, in my personal life, to this kind of story. And I, of course, when I started thinking of what I could do as a career, I was not thinking of that. I was thinking of working in the law field. That was really something I was interested in, also for personal reasons. And when I learned during the start of the Yugoslav situation that a tribunal was created to deal with atrocities, which I felt were very similar to what the Nazi had been doing, I thought it would be really an important thing for me to work in. So initially, I think I applied to the ICTY when I was working in more. I was a judge in France, and then I had worked in the area of human rights in France. And I applied to work at the ICTY. This didn't really work because probably I wasn't sufficiently
That's the International Criminal Tribunal
for the former Yugoslavia. Yeah. And then I had an opportunity to work for the UN in Bosnia during just after the Dayton agreements were signed, and I did that for 2 years. And so I was working on judicial reform, not directly on war crimes. And then I had the opportunity to work in Kosovo, where the war had just ended, but there were a number of war crimes, crime against humanity committed in Kosovo during that period. And I was I was hired as an international judge there. So that's how I, in fact, started working on that. And of course, later I joined the Yugoslav Tribunal and dealt with also crimes committed in Rwanda. I was not a judge there. I was a senior legal officer working in the chambers. And then I worked in Cambodia, indeed, as a judge in dealing with the Khmer Rouge crimes. So it's been a bit of a natural, based on this interest of mine, there's been a bit of a natural move into that area. And then
I mean, you could have stayed in France. What was it specific about these war crimes? I mean, it must be really tough. Rwanda, the genocide of 1 million people.
But I think those crimes are just concerning all of us as humans, right? They try to crush, to kill what's most important in humanity. So you feel, I felt connected. I felt that it was important, since I was a lawyer or judge, depending on which part of my career, that it was an area where I could be of use. I'm really glad to have had that opportunity. It's small steps that you do, not ever. You can't do it on your own. It's part of a team. It's part of an entity, an institution. But it's a rewarding word, in fact, even if you were asking about the frustration. It's less the frustration than the feeling of, it's often a drop in the ocean. There are so many crimes that you can't address. But what you do, if you do it well, if you do it with the intent of helping victims to get justice, I think it's rewarding. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder sometimes, do you lose faith in humanity when you hear about the crimes committed?
No, I don't, because I think in spite of all these atrocities, there are always individuals who are, giving you faith. So, yeah, I mean, it's clearly the dark side of humanity, but there are better sides to it. And in these terrible moments, you always have people who manage to show their humanity, and you also, you get the courage from the victims when you see that are still trying to, bring their life together, move forward. And in the case of Syria, I was really struck by this lack of revenge. I haven't seen many people wanting revenge. They want justice. And that's really a very powerful, a very powerful attitude.
It is. It's a certain form of resilience, I guess.
Yeah, so many people get stuck into what happened to them and just they can't, I'm not saying everyone wants to forgive, but it's empowering to decide that you're not just going to be a victim, you're going to help bringing justice. I think it's a very empowering attitude. It's not easy, but it's reassuring you in humanity.
What does your family say about what you do for a living?
Oh, I think they probably wonder why I spend so much time in those horrific situations. But as I said, I think they have been very important for me as making sure that I have, beside this part of my life, which is taking a lot of time, very very good moments where we're all together and we are.
You have children?
I don't have children myself, but I live with a family who has children, and we have grandchildren. So in a way, technically, I'm not a grandmother, but it's like.
Great. Well, Catherine, thank you very much for this interview.
Melissa, thanks a lot for listening to me.
Thank you for listening to Awake at Night. We'll be back soon with more incredible and inspiring stories from people working against huge challenges to make this world a better and safer place. To find out more about the series and the extraordinary people featured, do visit un.org/awake-at-night. Do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please take the time to review us. It helps more people find the show. Thanks to my editor, Bethany Bell, to Adam Paler, Josie LeBlond, and my colleagues at the UN, Katerina Katidi, Roberta Politi, Geneva Damayanti, Tulin Batiki, Becerra Kostova, Angelica Davis, Carlos Macias, and the team at the UN studio. The original music for this podcast was written and performed by Nadine Shaw and produced by Ben Hillier. Additional music was by Pascal Wise.